Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Tuesday, December the 8th, 2020. On this edition of the Politicrat podcast, a conversation with Nigel Nelson, the political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People in the UK. He's the longest-serving political editor in Britain. We'll be talking about the Labour Party and the election of 2019 in the UK and where Labour goes from here. That conversation coming up next. So, my guest today on the Politicrat podcast is Nigel Nelson. He's the longest-serving political editor in Britain. He has covered the House of Commons for a number of years now. He is the political editor for the Sunday Mirror in the UK and the Sunday People. He has a column called Nelson's Column, which you can find at mirror.co.uk, and his work is published there as well. Nigel Nelson, welcome to the Politicrat podcast.
Thanks, Omar.
I must say, it's really great to have you on, Nigel. I wanted to tell the listeners that we're going to be talking about the Labour Party in the UK and really the journey of Labour over the last 1 year or so. I mean, I want to take this in stages. Because later this week, will be the 1 year anniversary of the election from last year, the UK general election. And I do want to say that exactly a year ago today, Nigel, you had a Nelson's Column video, Nelson's Column, and you had said that you had a feeling in your waters, as you put it, that it could be a hung parliament. And our astonishment, it didn't happen that way.
I think we were all astonished. I mean, Boris Johnson was astonished. The Labour Party were astonished. There was just a chance of that. I mean, I think that Jeremy Corbyn had been riding on a high. They ruined it. They ruined it during the election campaign with a manifesto that basically people no longer believed. They were over-promising, and I think that's what turned a lot of people off. Back in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn had surprised us with an excellent manifesto, and the Conservative Party came up with an absolute dozer. It was unbelievably bad. So Theresa May lost her majority. Jeremy Corbyn didn't quite make it as PM, but we did think about this time last year, he still had a chance.
What is really fascinating to me, and you point to the manifesto, and this is exactly what I was going to get into, so this is really great that you've already prefaced it, is the manifesto issue. One of them, for me, watching this as an observer, is the Brexit part of this for Labour. Because people knew, and I think you're clear on this too, that personally, Jeremy Corbyn was someone who really was kind of more sceptical about staying, to put it nicely. He probably was a leaver. I think that's well known. And people had problems reconciling that, putting this manifesto putting the Labour had a deal. They wanted to put this deal to the people. And I think that threw people off. Don't you think that was an issue, the way they phrased that in the manifesto? Because people had made a decision in 2016. Now, we can definitely talk about how that decision came to be made and vote leave and all of those things. But for the purposes of Labour, Nigel, it seemed to me at least that offering people a deal after or a chance to vote on one after they had already decided in 2016 on a number of faulty premises that they wanted to leave, was that a problem also? Didn't you find that to be an issue with that manifesto?
Yes, I think it probably was. And one of the reasons why the Tories captured so many seats in the so-called Red Wall, and that's Labour heartlands in the Midlands and the north of England, was because the government promise of get Brexit done, which was the Boris Johnson line, resonated more with people there who were on the whole leavers. And yes, they didn't want a second referendum, that they felt the issue had been decided in 2016. And you're right about Jeremy Corbyn. Although he was a sort of Remainer in 2016, he didn't campaign very hard for Remain, and there was a feeling all the way through that underneath it all, he was actually a Eurosceptic anyway. So I think that played a major part in the 2019 election. And at the moment, obviously, that the people in the so-called Red Wall have lent the Tories their votes. Whether they will continue to do so come the next election, we'll have to see. But yes, Brexit played a big part. I think it was those two things that poleaxed Jeremy Corbyn, if you like. One was trying to overpromise, trying to do better than the 2017 manifesto, and people not believing it. And the second thing was over Brexit.
What also fascinates me, and I want to kind of move into, because of course, I mean, the leadership contest, which is a few months down the line in April of this year. So there's still there's a lot of autopsying going on in the party. And now we get to the Labour leadership contest of April of this year. And as you well know, and some of the listeners and viewers may know, there were a number of people that stood for the leadership of Labour. Jeremy Corbyn, I think, stood down in March of this year, to the best of my recollection. Some people were grumbling that he should have left earlier. By the way, what do you think about that? Do you think he should have left earlier or not?
No, I think that this has happened actually previously in 2015 when Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party. He lost the election, again, somewhat unexpectedly, and he quit immediately. The trouble with doing that is that while you go through your transition to the next leader, you effectively leave the party leaderless. So there was a view in Labour that Ed Miliband had jumped the gun. So when it came down to Jeremy Corbyn going, he knew immediately the election result came in that it was game over for him. There was no way that he was going to be able to stay on. And he purely stayed on through until March to keep Labour together, to give it some kind of leadership. It made sense. I mean, the alternative is you'd have another interim leader coming in. Easier for him to carry on. There was no question that he would ever enter the leadership contest himself, that he knew with a result like that, the worst result Labour had in 35 years, with a result like that, he had to go.
Right. And the lowest amount of seats for Labour since 1935, I believe they finished with 202 seats.
Sorry, I think you're right. It's 1935, not 35
right,
years.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it was indeed, yeah. It was that when you come back with a result like that, there is no way you can hang on. I mean, broadly, what Jeremy Corbyn had promised was a socialist revolution. That was what he was embarking on. I once suggested to him this would be a very British socialist revolution, and he rather liked that term. But there was no doubt that was the kind of direction he was going in. And the big question was, were voters going to accept that? Back in 2017, they very nearly did. By 2019, they were having second thoughts. So the whole Jeremy Corbyn project was over on the basis of the electorate rejecting that idea of this new socialist paradise that he was promising.
And the leadership contest in April of this year, rather interesting. I can rattle off a few names. Lisa Nandy was involved. Rebecca Long-Bailey, Lord Long-Bailey was involved. I believe Angela Rayner stood in that as well. Sir Keir Starmer stood. And I believe there may be one or two people that I may be missing out, Nigel. Can you talk a bit about that contest and some of what we've got now with the contest itself and how that contest evolved? Do you think that there was a lot of division during that leadership contest for Labour as you're transitioning from such a heavy defeat to the sorting out of leadership? Do you feel that, was there a lot? Can you just talk about the Labour leadership contest and the predicate to what we have now?
Yeah, I mean, the leadership contest was actually remarkably good-humoured for one of these things. It really came down to three candidates. That was Lisa Nandy, Keir Starmer, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Rebecca Long-Bailey effectively was carrying the Corbyn torch on, although she didn't put it quite that way after the defeat. But she was certainly the left-wing candidate and favoured by most of the Corbyn supporters. It then came down to the moderate wing, which was more Lisa Nandy, who is now Shadow Foreign Secretary in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet. So it's between Lisa Nandy and Keir Starmer. The feeling was all the way through that Keir Starmer was going to be the front runner.
And here we are now, almost a year on. And so Keir Starmer is the Labour leader, and as you put it, he made it very clear soon in April of this year that he wanted to bring the party together. He wanted to make sure that that he would tackle anti-Semitism and be forceful dealing with that. Jeremy Corbyn, a lot of hot water. There's an EHRC report that came out. He made comments about it. And that came across as somehow minimizing, or at least minimizing, the very serious issue of anti-Semitism. And that seems to me, Nigel, triggered a civil war in some senses. I mean, within the party again. And this is an issue that Labour has had a lot of trouble with. And certainly the Conservatives, let's not forget, the Conservatives have had a lot of trouble with all of these things as well. But what is your assessment now of Corbyn now? He's had the whip removed, but he's still in the party, nominally speaking, but he's not a parliamentary MP anymore. And there's a lot of factions in the party that have really risen up around this. You have the Momentum Group, Len McCloskey on the one hand, then you have the more moderate wing, as you've talked about. On the other hand, you have Dame Margaret Hodge, who has spoken out very clearly about the issue and the need to have Corbyn removed. Can you talk about that? Can you give your analysis and assessment of this phase of Labour now? It seems to be very voluble.
Yes, I mean, on the anti-Semitism issue, that Keir Starmer, during the campaign, was absolutely clear about this. I mean, it was one of the things that I talked to him about during one of our interviews, that it was going to be zero tolerance as far as anti-Semitism went. And when Rebecca Long-Bailey retweeted something that was considered anti-Semitic, he fired her immediately. There was no question about that. Now, with Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, it's quite interesting, sort of the genesis of the whole anti-Semitism debate. Jeremy Corbyn is not a racist. I've never seen any sign of a racist bone in his body, but he never quite got anti-Semitism. So what you had was that he has been his entire political life a great champion of Palestine. He blames Israel for what is happening in Palestine. And the trouble was that some of that tripped over into language that could be considered anti-Semitic. Now, even then, it was actually quite mild from Jeremy Corbyn's point of view. But of course, that kind of gave carte blanche to some Labour Party members to be more overtly anti-Semitic. And Jeremy Corbyn never quite got what was actually upsetting the Jewish community, that he felt he had the right to criticise Israel politically, which of course he does. And the real question was the language you go and use to do it. And it was that language that was upsetting Jewish groups in the UK. So fast forward now to Keir Starmer now taking over as leader. He decided that it had to be this zero tolerance approach, that they had to close down this whole anti-Semitism row once and for all. Now, when the Human Rights Commission report came out, Jeremy Corbyn used the word overstated when it came down to what he was being accused of. Now, there was no way that Keir Starmer could actually stand for that. And so at that point, Jeremy was suspended from the party. Very quickly, the party allowed him back in again, which was not in Keir Starmer's gift either way. He had to stay completely out of that. But what was in Keir Starmer's gift was to take away the Labour whip, which means that Jeremy Corbyn is not part of the Parliamentary party. He is not a Labour MP. He's effectively independent now. And we're still now waiting the outcome of that. Jeremy Corbyn remains suspended. His supporters gather around him, and it certainly galvanised them because they can't believe that their great hero is no longer a Labour MP. And this is an issue that still is yet to be resolved.
This is going to be very interesting because there's such a tension, I think. There is definitely problems in the Labour Party with anti-Semitism. I mean, we've seen the number of cases that have happened. There have been reports, Panorama's documentary and all these other things. But in addition to that, you have a group, as you point out, some of the strong supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, and then there's the more moderate wing. They just seem to keep going at each other, and I think that could really hurt Labour coming up. As dithering and as terrible as the Conservatives have been, in my humble opinion, Nigel, I honestly think that this infighting could really cannon out of control for Labour and really hurt them in the next election. What is your take on that? Do you think that that's the case? Do you think Sir Keir's doing a good job so far? What's your assessment of where Labour is now? We have a pandemic going on. How do you think the leadership is going at the moment?
Well, you're absolutely right that the battle between left and right in the Labour Party will do damage, and it always has. This has been going on for, well, almost as long as the Labour Party has existed, actually. But I mean, to make Labour electable, the left wing had to be defeated effectively. Neil Kinnock, when he was leader back in the 1980s, began that process. It was continued by Tony Blair, who took the party far more right. He would call moderate, but it was certainly going in a much more rightish type of way. By the time you get to Jeremy Corbyn, there's a backlash against that. Tony Blair, with the Iraq war behind him, became a totally toxic figure. And what Jeremy Corbyn wanted to do was expunge that kind of part of Labour's past. Now we're back in a more moderate direction. And I think that probably under Keir Starmer, we might be seeing a new kind of politics. Politics goes in cycles. So you've had Donald Trump, who was very much a populist president. We got Boris Johnson, who was very much a populist prime minister. And so it may be that we're moving away from that era of populism. And so what we'll end up with is people who are more competent, Joe Biden say, much more moderate, much more rational. And so Keir Starmer falls into that mould.
He certainly does. I would say to you also, the populism thing is such a tricky thing because where Donald Trump is concerned, at least in my estimation, he certainly used the tools of populism, and then he's been anything but that. But he uses that, like a lot of people do, to end up gaining power on a number of levels. But I wanted to add something to the conversation that we're having, because as you've pointed out, there's always been this internecine battle between these flanks of Labour, as there are in a number of parties. But I wanted to ask you, to what extent does your profession, Fleet Street, really shift the balance here? Do you think that, you've got different newspaper groups and different people owning them, the Barclay brothers, and they own, I guess, the Daily Mail and papers of that ilk, right, that are much more right-leaning right, and then you have other groups owning other newspapers. The politicization of Fleet Street and its own involvement in moving the needle of public opinion and influencing it has, to me, come to a really intense place in the UK. Can you talk about how Fleet Street has influenced things, particularly the Daily Express, the Mail, and any others, perhaps even your publication?
Well, I mean, my publication is a Labour-supporting paper. We are one of the few, actually, that mostly it is a Tory press. I think that that newspapers now are less influential than they were, say, back in the 80s, 90s. And really that social media is now far more important. And as people get more of their news from online or 24-hour news channels, that papers are less able to actually sway public opinion. But of course, the media kind of feeds off each other. I work for a Sunday newspaper, and the political week effectively begins both in America and in Britain on a Sunday. So what happens is the Sunday political shows feed off what we've actually put in the papers that Sunday and start to set the agenda for the following week. So while newspapers don't have the readership that they used to have, they're still in the game. But I don't think that the old days, the Sun would be a classic example of the Murdoch paper. And what the Sun claimed when Neil Kinnock was Labour leader, and they ran a really vicious campaign against him. The day after the election, the Sun front page headline was, "It was the Sun what won it." Now, no one would ever make a claim like that now, because newspapers just don't have, as I say, that kind of influence. But we do sometimes set the agenda. But as far as the politicians are concerned, they care more now about what appears on social media and online than they do about what is in print. It doesn't make print unimportant to them, but it doesn't have the same significance it used to.
One other thing about that, Nigel, that I wanted to put to you is that I've read accounts and I've heard of these accounts of people at places like Sky News, which I think was formerly owned by Murdoch. I don't think it is now. I think it's Comcast, but Murdoch used to have a stake or a controlling interest in Sky, to the best of my memory. I had seen reports of people at Sky meeting with Boris Johnson, for example, either at his flat or at Carrie Simon's flat before he became the Conservative Party leader. And I don't know whether they were meeting for just a cup of tea or whether it was something else. But it seems to me, I guess my point was, there's a lot more integration of politicians and media. And I think you pointed to it, that people do rely more on social media. And I guess I'm trying to get to is, do you notice more of that? You have covered the United Kingdom and the House of Commons over a number of years. Have you noticed that change, the integration between you've spoken to many politicians, Kinnock, Corbyn, John Major, a number of people. Have you noticed more of a synergy between politicians and the media and how their relationships are in your time doing this?
No, I don't think that's ever actually changed, in fact. That there's always been that kind of interaction between the two. Back in Tony Blair's day, when he was Prime Minister, he went out deliberately to court Rupert Murdoch. A lot of people in his party were furious about that. But I mean, it was public, it was overt. He wanted the Murdoch support, and in fact, eventually he got it. Also, I think there's a slight difference between broadcasting. Well, there's a big difference between broadcasting in the UK and broadcasting in the US. That our news broadcasters are very strictly regulated, the regulator being Ofcom, and as a result, that they have to be neutral in the sense that they give both sides of the story an equal time to each side. So we don't have, for instance, a Fox News over in the UK. as a result of that system. Yes, you will find that TV executives, just like newspaper executives, will have private meetings with politicians, but certainly as far as the broadcasters are concerned, that won't change the coverage of the politics.
Very interesting indeed, because certain reporters in the BBC are perceived to be very friendly to Boris Johnson. I don't want to necessarily mention their names. Maybe I should, but I won't. That seem very cozy with him. But I understand exactly what you're saying on that. I want to just say one other thing, or just ask you one other thing, really. Where do you see overall the Labour Party going? I think that would be the logical thing to ask you. Where do you think the party's going? We talked a few minutes ago about this kind of internecine battle that keeps going. Where do you think the party's heading here by the time we get to the 2023 or 4 general election?
It's 2024 at the moment.
Okay.
But we're getting an awful lot of conservative rebellions over COVID over here at the moment. So the last vote that was taken on more COVID restrictions, that Boris Johnson faced about 50, I think about 70 of his own MPs rebelling. Now, Boris loses his majority if more than 40 rebel. Although he's got a good 80-seat majority, he should be safe as houses. They've shown that he's not. So at the moment, the next election is scheduled for 2024, but it doesn't mean it won't come sooner. Anything can happen within the Conservative Party at the moment, especially post-Brexit. As far as Labour are concerned, the important thing for Keir Starmer, in the same way it was, I think, for Tony Blair, although they're different characters, the important thing is to actually show competence and ability to govern, to manage the economy, all things that Jeremy Corbyn was suspect about. And so at the moment, the way that Keir Starmer is operating is to show just that he is essentially a moderate, he's soft left rather than hard left. But his big thing is to show that he could be a credible prime minister, and the opinion poll ratings are going, his personal poll ratings are going up as people get to know him more. And it will be about this idea that Labour will be a competent government, which sort of goes back to my point about, I think that the age of populism might be over. So you're not looking for inspirational, charismatic leaders who can actually wow a crowd. You're looking for people who are more managerial, who show more competence than certainly we've seen recently. And especially in the post-Brexit, post-COVID world, assuming there ever is a post-COVID world, that's going to be hugely important. What Keir Starmer needs to do is to recapture those red wall seats to have any chance of forming a government anyway. But by showing those various things, I think he is on the right track to be able to do just that.
Nigel, I really do appreciate your time so much. Nigel Nelson, you're on Twitter as well, Nigel. Can you give the listeners and viewers your Twitter handle and any other information, social media-wise or paper-wise?
Yeah, the Twitter handle is @NigelNelson, and my email is nigel.nelson@sundaymirror.co.uk.
Excellent. Nigel Nelson. An honor to have you on, sir. Thank you so much. Nigel Nelson, the political editor of the Sunday People and the Sunday Mirror. He's the longest-serving political editor in Britain, and he regularly does commentary on television about the newspapers and the news of the day, and he can be found at mirror.co.uk as well, with Nelson's column, video and written dispatches about what's going on in the House of Commons. Nigel, thank you so very much for being on the Politicrat podcast today.
Thank you, Omar. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Special thanks once again to Nigel Nelson, the political editor at the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People in the UK. He is the longest serving political editor in Britain, and it was really great to have his insights on the Labour Party in the UK and all things politics. So again, special thanks to Nigel Nelson. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.